It was late spring 1945. The war in Europe was burning out, the Reich collapsing like a dying fire. The once mighty generals of Hitler's Wehrmacht, men who had commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, now shuffled like ghosts through the muddy ruins of surrender. Their medals were still pinned, their boots still polished, but their eyes were hollow. They weren't being marched into death camps, as many feared. No, these high-ranking officers were heading somewhere far stranger, to America. They'd expected hard bread, dirty water, maybe interrogation rooms reeking of cigarettes. But what they got was steak, grilled sandwiches, and a quiet humiliation unlike any bullet could deliver. When those German generals, men like Dietrich von Choltitz, Friedrich Paulus, and others whose pride had once filled continents, arrived at the U.S. Army's POW compounds, they didn't know what to expect. Most had been captured by British or American units in France or the Rhineland, and they were exhausted, starving, mentally shattered. But the Americans had a plan, a psychological plan. They weren't going to break these men with fists. They were going to break them with kindness, a weapon sharper than shrapnel. The first stop for many was a holding camp in France near Le Havre, where GIs treated them like guests in a hotel compared to the hell of the Eastern Front. "You boys hungry?" one American guard joked, tossing a loaf of bread across the table. The Germans, skeptical and stiff, didn't respond. Then came the shock. Trays of food like they hadn't seen in years. Butter, cheese, roasted meat, white bread, and hot coffee. For men who'd watched their own troops starve in Stalingrad, it felt surreal, even insulting. Some thought it was a trick. Others simply couldn't eat. Too proud, too confused. That was the first taste, both literal and psychological, of what the U.S. called re-education through decency. It was designed not to torture, but to dismantle ideology. The Americans knew something the Nazis didn't, that respect, when undeserved, burns more than hatred. And for the German generals, that burn began the moment they asked for bread and got steak instead. At night, as floodlights hummed over barbed wire and swing music drifted from the guards' radios, some of those men sat awake, staring at their full plates. They thought about their soldiers freezing in foxholes, about families under Allied bombs, about the Führer hiding in his bunker. And they couldn't understand how their enemy, the decadent Americans they'd mocked in propaganda, could show such mercy. But this was only the beginning, because when the generals reached America itself, to camps hidden deep in Texas, Virginia, and Mississippi, they were about to enter a world that would flip their entire understanding of power, pride, and morality. What awaited them wasn't barbed wire and beatings, but libraries, warm beds, and food that could have come from a Manhattan diner. And that was the real shock. The one that made them question everything they'd believed about superiority, loyalty,
and even the meaning of victory itself.
The train rolled across the American South like a ghost from another world. Inside, behind barred windows, sat men who had once commanded tank armies and divisions, now wearing plain khaki prisoner uniforms instead of decorated tunics. General Hans Kramer, who had fought under Rommel in North Africa, sat quietly staring out the window at endless fields of green. Outside, farmers waved at the train, kids chasing along the tracks, some shouting "Krauts," others just curious. To the Americans, these men were no longer a threat. They were just prisoners of a war that was already lost. But what stunned the generals most wasn't the journey, it was how they were treated. The gods didn't mock them, didn't hit them, didn't even yell. They were offered cigarettes, given blankets, and even told what to expect next. "You'll like Mississippi," one GI said with a grin. "Good food, warm weather, better than Berlin right now." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. The irony burned. When they arrived at Camp Shelby, the shock deepened. Rows of white barracks stood under the southern sun, clean and organized. The mess hall smelled of coffee and bacon. For men used to cold soup and crusts of bread back in Europe, this place felt unreal. One general whispered, "Are we prisoners or guests?" At lunch, they lined up, stoic and suspicious. The menu: steak, mashed potatoes, grilled cheese sandwiches, and apple pie. Real steak, cooked medium, dripping with butter. When General Paulus, the man who had surrendered at Stalingrad, was offered a plate, he hesitated. He looked at the cook, a young American soldier barely in his 20s, who smiled and said, "Sir, we don't serve bread alone here." Paulus muttered, "We asked only for bread." The soldier winked. "Yeah, and we gave you the American upgrade." That moment hit like a punch. The generals sat in silence, forks trembling. They'd been ready to hate their captors, ready for starvation and scorn. But this was mercy twisted into a mirror. It showed them who they really were, what they'd fought for, and how far they'd fallen. The Americans weren't trying to feed their bodies, they were feeding doubt into their souls. Days turned into weeks. The German officers were allowed to walk inside the camp freely. They attended English lessons, played chess with guards, even listened to jazz on the radio. But behind the friendly faces, the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division was always watching. Every kind act, every warm meal was a calculated strike, not on their stomachs, but on their ideology. The steak wasn't just food, it was strategy. At night, under dim barrack lights, the generals debated. "Are they mocking us?" one hissed, "or trying to forget who we are?" Another replied quietly, "No, they're showing us what we could never be." And that silence that followed said more than words ever could. What they didn't know yet was that this was only phase 1. Soon, they'd be taken to America's most secret interrogation site, hidden behind manicured lawns and English-style manners. A place where they'd talk freely, not because they were tortured, but because they were treated better than kings. And when the steak and grilled sandwiches came again, this time served with jazz and soft chairs, even the proudest among them would finally start to crack. The convoy pulled up before dawn, headlights slicing through the Virginia fog. The German generals, now fewer in number, but higher in rank, peered through the truck slats at what looked like an American country club. Neatly trimmed hedges, white fences, even tennis courts glistening with dew. A small sign read, "Fort Hunt, U.S. Army property." But to the outside world, this place didn't exist. Its real name was P.O. Box 1142, one of the most secret facilities in America during World War II. As the doors opened, they expected interrogation rooms, bare bulbs, the usual humiliation of captivity. But what they got was something far more unnerving. The officers were escorted not by barking guards, but polite men in suits. One introduced himself with a handshake and a smile. "Welcome, gentlemen. We hope your stay will be comfortable." That word, comfortable, sent a ripple of unease through the group. Inside, the rooms had carpets, soft beds, even curtains. Breakfast was served hot: eggs, sausages, toast, orange juice. The smell alone was enough to make them forget they were prisoners. But nothing here was accidental. Every fork, every chair, every "sir" from a guard was part of a plan to make these men talk without ever realizing they were being interrogated. Hidden microphones lined the walls. Conversations in the dining hall, muttered regrets in German, even dreams spoken aloud at night, all recorded. The Americans had discovered something incredible. When treated with respect and decency, the proudest men on earth couldn't stop themselves from talking. They'd boast, reminisce, and eventually reveal secrets they'd sworn to die with. It was during one of those quiet dinners that the most surreal moment came. A U.S. officer, posing as a simple liaison, joined the generals for supper. The table was neatly set. Steaks again. Grilled sandwiches, French fries, pickles, even bottles of Coca-Cola. The Germans looked at the food, then at each other, half in disbelief. One finally said, "We asked for bread again." The American smiled. "In this country, General, bread's just the start." They ate in silence, the taste rich, but heavy with guilt. Paulus, gaunt and haunted by Stalingrad, finally spoke. "In Russia, my men ate rats to stay alive. Here, you give me steak." The officer leaned back,
calm and casual. Maybe that's the difference between what you fought for and what we fight for. That line landed like an artillery shell. The generals didn't respond, but from that moment on, something shifted. The next morning, the microphones picked up whispers, details about new German jet projects, submarine bases, V-weapons, things no one had managed to extract by force. It wasn't the fear of punishment that made them talk. It was the realization that their enemy's kindness was stronger than their empire's cruelty. One American intelligence report later wrote, "They came expecting vengeance. We gave them coffee and steak. By dessert, they were confessing everything." Weeks later, new groups of POWs arrived. The routine repeated: good meals, jazz music, polite guards. But behind the scenes, American analysts were building the picture of Hitler's collapsing war machine, piece by piece, straight from the mouths of men who'd sworn never to speak. To the generals, it felt like a strange dream, being fed better by their captors than by their own army. To the Americans, it was proof that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a gun, it's a grilled sandwich and a smile.
By the time summer rolled across Virginia, the German generals had been at Fort Hunt long enough to lose track of days. The war they once commanded was over. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the Reich was ash and rumor. But here, inside manicured fences and the quiet hum of American hospitality, the war inside them was only beginning. Every evening, the dinner bell would ring, that same old rhythm of routine, the same smell of butter, seared steak, and toasted bread wafting through the air. For the Americans, it was just another meal. For the Germans, it had become a daily reminder of everything they couldn't explain. They had led a war that promised glory, conquest, and superiority. And yet it was the soft Americans, the jazz-listening, sandwich-eating soldiers who'd won. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned gold, General Kramer broke the silence at dinner. "Tell me, Captain," he said to one of the American hosts, "why do you feed us like this? Your soldiers died because of men like us." The young officer smiled faintly, slicing his steak. "Because, General, we're not you. We don't feed hate, we starve it." That line hit harder than any interrogation could have. Paulus, sitting across the table, stared at his plate. His hands trembled slightly. "In our prisons, your men would have been beaten, mocked, starved." The American shrugged. "Then maybe that's why we're sitting on this side of the table." It wasn't just talk. The food itself became a message. The Americans used generosity like a language, one the generals couldn't ignore. They began writing letters to their families, careful ones, censored, of course, but their tone had changed. They spoke less of Hitler
and more of home, less of vengeance and more of peace.
Every act of kindness chipped away at their steel. When the guards brought them coffee refills or shared cigarettes, it wasn't politics, it was empathy. And for men who'd spent years worshipping discipline and dominance, that was terrifying. Mercy made them question everything. Behind the scenes, American intelligence officers kept listening. The microphones picked up conversations no one expected to hear. Generals crying quietly after lights out. One confessing he'd known the war was lost in '43, but couldn't say it aloud. Another whispering that maybe, just maybe, their enemies weren't the monsters they'd been told they were. One night, after a dinner that ended with cherry pie and coffee, Paulus said something the hidden microphones caught crystal clear. He told his table mates, "If the Führer could see us now, the men who asked for bread and were given steak, he'd call us weak. But maybe weakness is what saves us." That line was marked, underlined, and stored in Washington's files. It was proof that America's quiet strategy, the one built not on pain but on decency, had worked better than any whip or gun. And when those generals finally left Fort Hunt, their heads weren't held high. They weren't defiant. They were quiet, changed. Some even shook hands with their guards, whispering "thank you" in broken English. It wasn't surrender anymore. It was something far deeper: acceptance. The steak and grilled sandwiches had done what bullets couldn't. They'd ended a war inside the minds of men who once believed mercy was weakness.
The war was over. Europe lay in ruins. Cities turned to skeletons, streets littered with memories. When the German generals were finally released from American custody, they didn't step off the ship as conquerors or martyrs. They came home as men who had tasted something far more unsettling than defeat: compassion from the very people they were taught to hate. As they walked through the bombed-out train stations of Bremen and Hamburg, the stench of ash and hunger hung in the air. Civilians scavenged through rubble for bread. Children with hollow eyes watched them pass. The same men who once commanded divisions now stood in food lines beside the people they had once ruled over. And that's when the memories hit hardest. The steak, the sandwiches, the laughter of young American guards. It all felt like a dream, one that mocked the reality of the broken Reich they'd returned to. Some tried to bury it, others couldn't. In one debriefing report years later, a former POW general admitted, "We were treated as men, not monsters. It confused us. It still does." Another wrote, "The Americans won not by their weapons, but by proving us wrong about what strength really means." For many of them,
That time in captivity changed the trajectory of their lives. Some became outspoken against the remnants of Nazi ideology, quietly encouraging a new democratic Germany. Others lived in shame, unable to reconcile how the enemy's mercy exposed the moral bankruptcy of everything they had fought for. Paulus, once the Iron Commander of Stalingrad, spent his later years reflecting on that contrast. In interviews, he never forgot to mention the food. "They fed us steak," he said once, pausing as if the word itself carried too much weight. "When we asked for bread," and in that gesture I saw what we never understood, the power of decency. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., few Americans even knew about places like Fort Hunt or Camp Shelby. The soldiers who had served there rarely spoke of it. It wasn't glamorous. There were no medals for kindness, no parades for feeding your enemy. But those quiet, nameless GIs had played one of the most brilliant psychological games in history, and won. Because while the world saw Germany's cities burn, America was busy winning the battle for its soul. One steak, one sandwich, one handshake at a time. Years later, historians would dig through the declassified files of P.O. Box 1142, reading transcripts of those hidden recordings, and buried in them were voices, proud once, now softened, talking about family, regret, and strange gratitude. Men who once swore loyalty to a dictator, whispering "thank you" to their captors. And maybe that's what this story really was about. Not victory or vengeance, but redemption. Not through weapons, but through humanity. When those generals asked for bread, America gave them steak, and in doing so, it fed them something far greater, the taste of conscience. Time has a funny way of blurring history. The battles fade, the heroes die, the flags change. But for those German POW generals who once asked for bread and got steak and grilled sandwiches instead, that taste never really faded. It stayed with them. Not just the flavor of American food, but what it meant. Years later, some of them would talk about it in interviews, their voices softer now, stripped of arrogance. One of them said, "I came to America expecting punishment. I found something worse, forgiveness." Another recalled a young U.S. soldier who had poured him coffee in Fort Hunt's dining hall and said with a grin, "We feed folks right round here." That moment, he said, broke him more than the fall of Berlin ever could. Because food, the simplest gesture, had turned into a mirror, and what they saw reflected back wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form, the kind that doesn't need to dominate, only to prove it's better, the kind of power that builds instead of burns. Back in those camps, when the war had just ended, one of the generals scribbled something in a small notebook before being sent home. The note was later found in U.S. archives. It read, "They won by kindness, and I will never understand how we ever thought we could defeat that." That's the real end of this story. Not a surrender, not a treaty, not a headline, but a quiet dinner table somewhere in 1945, where enemies sat across from each other, and humanity finally won. And that, my friends, was German POW generals asked for bread and got steak and grilled sandwiches instead. A true story that reminds us, sometimes, victory doesn't come from force, but from compassion. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating psychological stories, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell, so you never miss the next untold chapter from World War II. Because on this channel, we don't just tell history, we feel it. Until next time, stay curious, stay human, and I'll see you in the next story.